The start of our story today on the Italian battleship Roma starts a little after World War I, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and the two subsequent naval treaties that were signed between the major powers of the world. The German Navy, after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, was limited to ships no larger than 10,000 tons, and having guns no bigger than 11 inches. Figuring the Germans to have been dealt with, the other nations focused on limiting their own and each other's naval building programs so they could, in reality, avoid going broke, participating in costly naval races. They eventually worked out hard limits for cruisers and limits to battleship tonnage that each nation was allowed. Heavy cruisers would be limited to 10,000 tons and guns no bigger than 8 inches, and large capital ships up to a maximum of 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. And all seemed great until the Germans produced the Deutschland-class Panzerschiffs, a columnist raider listed at 10,000 tons with guns of 11 inches that could sail at a comfortable 26 knots. This immediately caused headaches for the French Navy, whose heavy cruisers on paper were inadequate to deal with this new German ship, and whose battleships, who could deal with the German raider, were simply too slow. For example, ships like the Bretagne could only do 20 knots. This, of course, led to the French battlecruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg, whose armor was meant to protect them from 11-inch shells of the Deutschland and had plenty of speed to run the raiders down. This development, of course, pushed the Italians to do something about these new French ships as well, who, after all, in the event of a war, would most likely be facing off with the French Navy in the Mediterranean, which would lead us to the Littorio class of ships, of which Roma was one of 3 such vessels completed. The 4th, Impero, was never finished. If you thought this entire thing sounded a lot like, my battleship is bigger and better than your battleship pissing contest, you'd actually be correct. The Dunkirk class also caused the Germans to look into building something that could defeat the ship, which led to the Scharnhorst class of ships, which, if you remember, was designed to have their main gun switched to 380mm in the event war broke out. The French reaction to the Littorio class of ships was to go ahead and build the Richelieu class ships, armed with 15-inch guns, and were quite capable adversaries to the Littorio class battleships that the Italians had built. But today's story is about none of those other ships, so we're going to focus our attention back on the Roma. The Roma was a slightly modified Littorio class battleship, as she was slightly longer at 240.68 meters compared to 237.76 meters of the 2 previous Littorio class ships, Littorio, later to be renamed Italia, and the Vittorio Veneto. Roma had a draft of 9.6 meters and a beam of 32.82 meters. Roma displaced 40,992 tons, the heaviest of the 3 Littorio class ships. Roma was powered by 4 Belluzzo geared steam turbines, which were fed by 8 oil-fired Yarrow boilers. The engines were rated 428,200 shaft horsepower for a design top speed of 30 knots, although both Littorio and Vittorio Veneto both exceeded their design speeds during trials, although exact data for the Roma has been lost. These images that you're seeing are the engine rooms on the battleship Roma, and for those of you who've seen museum ship engine rooms like on the US Iowa class battleships, for example, or the North Carolina, these pictures you will actually see quite a few similarities. It was initially planned to arm the ships with 406mm guns. However, Italian industry would have taken a very long time to get such weapons designed and made. So it was decided to utilize existing technology developed for the stillborn Francesco Caracciolo class battleships in order to get the new class of ship into service as quickly as possible. The 9 381mm guns were placed into 3 triple turrets, 2 in the front and 1 aft. The guns could lob an 884.8 kilogram armor-piercing shell at 870 meters per second muzzle velocity, although this was later reduced down to 850 meters per second to help out with dispersion and barrel life, out to a pretty incredible range of 42,800 meters with very good penetration. However, the ships did suffer from, like I mentioned earlier, short barrel life, about half the barrel life of heavy guns of other nations, and the gun, more seriously, had dispersion problems, which was to be one of the major unresolved technical problems facing the Italian Navy during the Second World War. This next clip is a pretty good animation for how a gun on board the Roma was loaded. So first things first, and this goes level by level, by the way. So first things first, you need to get the shell out of the magazine. You have two rings, the inner and outer ring. The inner ring is the one that is directly connected to the turret, and the outer ring basically can move independently. This allows it to move into a position to receive the shell, and then transport that shell to a position where it can be loaded onto a lift so that it can be sent up to the guns. So in this particular case, the shell gets brought around, gets put into that lift, and then right above, on another level, the same is being done to bags of powder. They get brought around, they get put into the lift, and both the bags of powder and the shell get sent up. And they will get sent up to the next level up, where the bags of powder and the shell will be put into a single unit to be sent up to the guns. So here you are, you'll see they get all pushed in together, they get tilted over, and 3 rammers will push it into a uniform unit to be sent up to the guns, which, if you look at it, when it goes into a cutaway look, it's basically a lift, right? And then as this lift goes up to the guns, an empty lift will come down from the other side. That is the one that has just been used. Once this unit reaches the position where the guns can be loaded, the gun will return after it's fired into a loading position, and then the breech will open and everything will be rammed home. So here we go. Breech opens up, little ramp comes down. This is followed by a bigger ramp from where the lift has just arrived. And of course, obviously the first thing to be rammed home will be the shell. And then once the shell has been rammed home, the lift will go down a little bit, which will allow the bags of powder to be rammed home. And remember, there were 6 bags in total, so there we go. The remaining 3 bags get rammed home. And then, of course, the ramp will come back up, the small ramp will come back up, move to the side. The breech will close, and the gun will return back to the firing position. And there we go. Gun is fired. But that is the operation of one gun only, and you do remember that the Roma has 3 guns in one turret. So this is a look of what it would look like when all 3 guns are being used. And as you can tell, things are a little bit more complex as there's a lot more moving parts. Roma's armor profile was designed to deal with the threats that she'd have to deal with in her theater of operations, namely French battleships, and probably some consideration was given to France's ally, Great Britain. Her vertical protection was quite good, providing the Roma protection against 381mm shells at a minimum range of 16,000 meters. She had a 70mm external belt that was meant to decap armor-piercing shells, which was followed by a 280mm main belt, and this was followed by 50mm of wood backing, behind which was another 25mm plate. Then there was a 36mm splinter plate, which then after that, further inwards, was another 24mm plate inclined in the opposite direction to deflect remaining projectiles and provide additional splinter protection. On the other hand, horizontal protection on the Roma wasn't amazing. She had a 36mm upper deck, a 12mm second deck, and finally the main armor deck was around pretty much 100mm everywhere and 162mm over the magazines. Her weakness in her horizontal protection is understandable, as the main navy she was expected to combat was the French Navy, which had minimal carrier aviation assets. Her main gun barbette armor was 350mm, while the turrets had 350mm faces and 200mm sides. The Roma was also equipped with the Pugliese deformation cylinder system, which worked on the theory that a weaker empty cylinder put between the bulkhead and the ship's side, suspended in fuel oil and water, would crumple to absorb the energy from a torpedo hit, preventing damage to that inner bulkhead. The system was tested in 2 naval tankers and was then incorporated into the Roma's design. However, poor structural connections in terms of a riveted joint that connected the interior bulkhead to the bottom of the ship caused the joints to fail, preventing the hollow drum from collapsing and leading to some pretty severe flooding. Still, it should be noted that the Littorio-class battleships were hit by torpedoes during the course of the Mediterranean campaign, and none were sunk. This picture that you see shows to the left what the Pugliese deformation cylinder system looks like normally, and on the right side, what it was supposed to do when it was hit by a torpedo. The Roma's design also had three completely independent rudders. Now they could be used together, but in the event of damage, they could be used independently to steer the ship. These rudders were well separated and provided the ship with excellent maneuverability. Now, had the Bismarck used a similar system, the torpedo hit by the Swordfish would not have had devastating consequences as it did. However, as you can see from this picture, the Bismarck system was not nearly as damage-proof as the Roma's. Now, I did mention earlier that the Roma's design was primarily aimed at defeating French opposition, and this is also reflected in the choice of secondary guns. Roma was equipped with secondaries that would allow her to adequately deal with French destroyers, such as this Le Fantasque class destroyer. Roma was equipped with 4 triple turrets of the single-purpose 152mm 55 caliber gun, and these guns were able to throw a 44.4 kilogram high-explosive shell out to a range of 24,900 meters. These weapons were the identical weapons mounted to Italian light cruisers, so they were perfect for dealing with French destroyers. The weapons had the best dispersion out of any of the Italian 152mm guns, but they were still pretty bad with the high explosive ammunition, namely because of the fault with the high explosive shell design. Now, a corrected design was created, but it was never able to enter service. So, Italian secondary guns, unfortunately, also had dispersions that were not that great. Anti-aircraft armament on the Roma was relatively light, and her 90mm tertiary guns were not very reliable as they were overly complex for their time and were prone to frequent breakdowns. Roma also carried 3 RO-43 floatplanes, but these were completely obsolete by the time World War II rolled around. And in 1942, RE-2000 land-based fighters were converted to be catapult fighters that could be sent up, although these planes could not land aboard the ship. So after a mission, the pilots either had to land at a land base or ditch into the sea and get picked up by the ship. The major reason that there was a need for catapult fighters was because instead of the mostly carrier aviationless French Navy that the Italian Navy expected to fight, they ended up having to deal with the Royal Navy, whose carriers would provide the Royal Navy with a decisive edge when engagements occurred. When the Roma was commissioned in June of 1942, she was a powerful warship that could have caused serious disruptions to Allied supply convoys to North Africa and Malta. However, massive fuel shortages prevented Roma from basically doing anything at all. She trained up her crew, was moved to a bunch of random ports to provide some anti-aircraft cover, but all in all, she did absolutely nothing when it came to combat operations. She's officially listed as having logged 0 actual combat missions. In September of 1943, barely 15 months after the ship was commissioned, Italy capitulated to the Allies. Italian ships, which were ready to head out for one major attack against the Allied invasion force, were told instead to sail to Allied ports to prevent them from falling into German hands. Roma, now the flagship, along with Italia and Vittorio Veneto, accompanied by other ships that were capable of sailing, left La Spezia on the evening of September the 8th to head towards Allied-controlled ports. The Germans found out about the fleeing Italian ships and wanted to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. So on September 9, 1943, German Dornier 217 bombers attacked Italian battleships with brand new Fritz X radio-guided bombs. 2 bomb hits were obtained on the Roma. The first one was not catastrophic. Hit sort of around the midships area and managed to penetrate all the way through the hull. Came out through the bottom and then exploded. This caused the after engine room and the 2 boiler rooms of the ship to be flooded, which reduced the speed of the ship, causing her to fall out of formation. The second hit, however, was devastating. It penetrated near the number 2 turret and penetrated into the powder room. This explosion was devastating. It caused the entire 1,500-ton number 2 turret to fly right out of the ship. The ship capsized quickly, broke in 2, and sunk within a matter of minutes. She took around 1,300 officers and sailors to a watery grave. In her 15 months of service, the Roma conducted 0 combat operations, sailed for around 133 hours for a total of only 4,010 kilometers. The wreck of the Roma was discovered in June of 2012, 30 kilometers off the northern coast of Sardinia, at a depth of around 1,000 meters. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this Know Your Ship episode on the Roma, and I wish all of you an awesome start to 2018. This Know Your Ship episode was made possible with the amazing support of these patrons, who I would like to say thank you so much for your support, and I look forward to continue to provide amazing content for all of you.